Thank you for joining me as I continue my critique of Carl Gallups' book, The Magic Man in the Sky, from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to review chapters 4, 5, and 6 of the book. So let's get started right away with chapter 4, which is titled The Non-Answer. Gallups begins this chapter with a torturous, overlong, tone-deaf, just utterly witless telling of the lost helicopter joke. And in case you haven't heard the lost helicopter joke, here it is. A pilot and a co-pilot are flying their helicopter over a city in very, very thick fog. They get disoriented, have no idea where they are, have no idea how to get back to the airport, when the pilot has a brilliant idea. He flies in close to a building where he sees some lights on, gets close enough so that the people in the building can see him in the helicopter through the fog. He has his co-pilot write up a sign in big black letters, and the sign reads, "Where am I?" He holds up the sign to the people in the office building. The people in the building read the sign, and they make their own sign in reply. And their sign says, "You are in a helicopter." So the pilot smiles and waves at them and pulls the helicopter back and flies straight through the fog with total confidence, lands at the airport safely. He and his co-pilot get off the helicopter. The co-pilot is just amazed. He says, "How in the world did you find your way back to the airport from that building in all that fog?" The pilot says, "Well, all I needed was a landmark to tell me where I was so that I could figure out where I had to go to get here. And when the people in that building gave me an answer to my question that was technically correct, but utterly useless, I knew that had to be the Microsoft building." Now, it's not a great joke, but there's the joke. And if I may say, in all modesty, the way I told it was a hell of a lot better than the way Carl Gallups tells it in this book, because he takes 2.5 pages to tell that joke that I just told you. And he even botches the punchline when he gets to the end. The point of telling that joke was to demonstrate or to suggest that the secular worldview is just like the people in the building holding up the "You are in a helicopter" sign. Secularism gives us those kind of answers, according to Carl Gallup. Technically correct answers that are useless because they ignore the Word of God and don't take into account the eternal consequences of which God's Word informs us. Gallups says, quote, "A simple example of this dichotomy would be the basic declaration of evolutionary theory. Evolution states that speciation, the process by which individual species undergo certain identifiable physical changes over time, is an observable scientific phenomenon, and that speciation occurs through the process of natural selection." Let me stop here because Gallups goes on about evolution for most of the rest of this chapter, and I'm going to be quoting him extensively as he does so. Gallups, it seems, is of the Ray Comfort school of evolutionary biology. That is, someone who fancies himself an expert on the subject despite evidently knowing nothing about it. The point worth remembering here is that Gallups seems to have some understanding of what speciation is. That is, that new species arise from existing species as a result of accumulated evolutionary changes. And he accepts, or at least he seems to accept, that speciation occurs. Check this out, quote, "Limited speciation is a technical truth and a scientifically proven fact. Man has observed certain changes over time within various species of living things. A number of these changes occur through breeding and genetic transference. Still other changes on occasion come because of environmental factors. The enlightened Christian would not deny these proven and observable facts." Well, it gets a little confused there. Changes appear over time within a species, but change within a species isn't speciation. Speciation occurs when the changes accumulate to the point that a new, distinct species arises, hence the term speciation. And this new species can either branch off from its ancestor species, and when that happens it's called cladogenesis, or the ancestor species can evolve into a new species over time within a single unbranching lineage, and that's called anagenesis. But either way, it's more than just changes occurring within a species. It's the accumulation of changes resulting in a new species. That is speciation. So Gallups' grasp of speciation is kind of shaky after all. In fact, judging by this next passage, where he switches back and forth between the terms species and kind, he doesn't really know what he's talking about, and he hopes that his readers won't know either. Quote, "However, this piece of accurate information does not even come close to proving that we have no need of an intelligent designer. In fact, the creation scientist would argue the opposite, because when a small change takes place within a species, the species always remains a certain kind. In other words, dogs are always dogs, regardless of how many various species of the dog exist. Dogs never become another kind of living thing. In addition, the latest DNA evidence powerfully suggests that humans have always been humans, and chimps have always been chimps, in spite of evolution's insistence that the two somehow relate through a common ancestor. Unfortunately for the evolutionist, that elusive common ancestor has never been confirmed or discovered, although this does not stop the insistence that one exists somewhere." The thing is, there's only one species of dog, Canis lupus familiaris. That's the only species of dog that there is. The domestic dog, in fact, is no longer considered to be its own species. It's classified as a subspecies of the gray wolf, which is Canis lupus. When Gallups mentions various species of dog, he is presumably referring to different breeds. But different breeds of dog are still all the same species of dog. They are all still Canis lupus familiaris. So Gallups has now confused the terms species, kind, and breed with each other, even though they each mean different things. Except, of course, for kind, which is an unscientific term that creationists use, which means whatever they need it to mean in a given conversation. And that's a really great question to ask a creationist, because they will be unable to give you a definitive answer. What is a kind? When you talk about a kind of animal, what do you mean? Is kind analogous to a species? Is kind analogous to a genus? A family? It's a very vaguely defined term, probably on purpose. I have no idea what he's talking about with the DNA evidence suggests humans have always been humans bit. That is either a gross misunderstanding or something Gallups just straight made up. And common ancestors aren't elusive. Whether a common ancestor between humans and chimps, or between any other two species for that matter, is ever confirmed in the fossil record is irrelevant. The existence of that common ancestor can be confidently inferred from the genetic evidence. Humans and chimps are genetically related. This is a fact. Therefore, humans and chimps share a common ancestor. That's what being related means. Gallups describes the, quote, insistence that a common ancestor exists as though it's this nutty idea that evolutionary biologists invented to piss off creationists. But it's not a nutty idea, it's an inevitable conclusion based on the available evidence. If two humans are genetically tested and found to be siblings, then it is a fact that they share parents. Whether or not these parents can be found and identified, it is a fact that they must have existed. The same is true of genetically related species. The common ancestor must be there, whether we can find an example of it in the fossil record or not. One more bit of non-expertise from Gallups on the subject of evolution. Quote, "The creationist would also argue that speciation is a process that apparently knows how to bring about certain changes within a species while at the same time preserving genetic locks, ensuring that one kind of life cannot become another kind of life." And the creationist would not only be wrong, but he would also not know what the term speciation means. If you haven't noticed, I'm sure you have, Gallups is simply misappropriating would be a better way of describing it, the term speciation, and he is using it in his text the same way other apologists refer to the supposed impenetrable barrier between microevolution and macroevolution. He has no choice but to acknowledge the truth and the existence, the occurrence of microevolution, but he can't acknowledge macroevolution. That goes against his argument. So he's not using those terms, he's just using speciation and limited speciation and things like that. There are no genetic locks. to ensure that one species doesn't give rise to another, or to ensure that evolution only occurs within stable, permanent species. The entire concept of a species is a human construct that enables us to classify organisms and to better understand how they relate to each other. There aren't barriers separating one species from another, or preventing an existing species from giving rise to a new, distinct species in the future. Genetic locks, as Gallups calls them, are an invention of creationists based on absolutely no scientific evidence whatsoever to enable them to accept the undeniable fact of small-scale evolutionary change while denying that large-scale changes occur. If genetic changes accumulate to result in small-scale changes, such as different breeds of dog, there is nothing to stop them, given enough time, from continuing to accumulate to result in larger scale changes, such as speciation. There is no such thing as a genetic lock. Well, that's chapter 4. Moving on to chapter 5, which is titled, When Two Worlds Collide. Gallups emphasizes the important distinction between truth and true truth. Quote, "We have truth, which modern science often declares with confidence. Much of the time, the declaration of that truth turns out to be true truth, but at times it does not. Every now and then, a declaration of truth turns out to be momentary truth. Between true truth and momentary truth is a world of difference." So, truth is what we think is true based on our best efforts to discover it. Momentary truth is something we think is true for a time, but later turns out to be false. And true truth is what is actually true, whether we know it or not. Unfortunately for Gallups, who I assume will shortly declare that he knows the true truth, or at least a part of it, we can't ever know for certain whether a given truth is a true truth or merely a momentary truth that will someday be shown to be false. These are just the limitations of our consciousness, of our perception, of our brains. We will never know with 100% certainty whether something that we think is true is actually true. We can have confidence, but we can't have total certainty. Anyway, as an example of something that turned out to be a momentary truth but was once thought of as a truth or a true truth, Gallups cites Aristotle's theory of spontaneous generation, which held that living matter spontaneously arose or appeared from non-living matter. For example, maggots seeming to appear out of nowhere on rotting food. Gallups says, quote, "Aristotle's theory turned out to be little more than sheer superstition. Germ theory and cell theory replaced the disproved spontaneous generation. Now, one would be considered superstitious and or ignorant if he believed that something living could appear by magic from something that up until that time was non-living." Well, Aristotle's theory wasn't superstitious. It was just based on inaccurate and incomplete information. He didn't believe spontaneous generation was magic. He believed that it was part of the natural order, that that's just how things worked. And he had what he thought was good evidence to support it. When his theory was eventually discarded, it was due to the discovery of new evidence and the formulation of new theories better able to account for and explain that evidence. Anyway, I think you might be able to tell where Gallups is going with this. Gallups describes abiogenesis, the process by which life emerges from non-life, as being a modern version of spontaneous generation. Since spontaneous generation has been discredited, so too should abiogenesis be, Gallups argues. Unable to contain his incredulity, Gallups explains that the, quote, unscientific, ancient, and superstitious idea of abiogenesis claims that life arose from non-life and that all modern life forms are descended from this single common ancestor. Abiogenesis is a very active and fascinating field, by the way. I highly recommend looking into it if you're interested in science. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, there was a story in the news about a study that proposed a method by which simple biomolecules could have formed and eventually given rise to the earliest forms of life. And that is just one hypothesis among many. As I say, it is a fascinating and incredibly active field, abiogenesis. Gallups refers to it, abiogenesis, as just existing in a very general sense. What he doesn't tell his readers is that though we don't know for sure how the first life did come to be, there are many plausible explanations for how it could have come to be, all of which are natural explanations, none of which require the intervention of an intelligent designer or a god or a creator to get started. Maybe one of these will turn out to be true. Maybe it will turn out to be something else that hasn't been thought of yet. But the point is, the notion of life arising from non-life is not the far-fetched thing that Gallups wants his readers to believe. Life, at its most basic level, is a chemical process. Why is it so unfathomable that the chemical processes, however complex they may be, which we define as being part of life, could have been products of other non-living chemical processes? As with speciation, it seems as though creationists like Gallups are drawing in their own imaginary barriers and then insisting that those barriers are real. Luckily for those who feel their Christian fundamentalism threatened by the unscientific, superstitious concept of abiogenesis, Gallups has his own explanation for where life came from. Quote, God created Adam and Eve with the innate ability to understand the truth. Their view of the world and life was God-centered. In their original form, they walked and communicated with God in person. So there you go. A nice, tightly reasoned, evidence-based, scientific explanation for where God came from. But why would people abandon this particular true truth for superstitious foolishness like abiogenesis? Well, there's a scientific explanation for that too. Quote, the Bible reveals that Satan, the adversary, deceitfully removed the clarity that God gave them and convinced Eve to see things through a window of self-centeredness. The introduction of that worldview in the end led to destruction. From Eve's self-destruction, the deception of the secular worldview has been forever passed down to humankind through the ages. Secularism comes from Satan. Like I said, nice, plausible, scientific explanation, not the least bit superstitious. Gallups claims that the creation account in the beginning of Genesis, interpreted literally, is the truly true explanation of where life came from. He blames the secular worldview, motivated by Satan, of course, and he does actually say that, for attacking this biblical explanation and inspiring doubt even among many modern Christians, or as Gallups calls them in the most ecumenical of spirits, people who claim to be of the Christian faith. Now, do you see how Gallups is so selective with the application of his scientific skepticism? He jumps all over Aristotle, shouting from the highest mountain that spontaneous generation has been disproved and Aristotle was just a superstitious fool and it's been replaced by better established theories. But then he pretends that the same thing isn't true about the Genesis creation story. Here's the thing, scientifically speaking, with no axe to grind against Gallups' religion or the God he believes in, with no particular desire to prove him among all people wrong, the Genesis creation account, taken literally, is false. Period. You can believe in whatever God you want. You can love the Genesis account. You can interpret it so that it isn't flatly contradicted by the scientific consensus, as many Christians do, though Gallups doesn't consider them to be genuine Christians, but then again, who fucking asked him anyway? But we know scientifically that the Earth was not created before the rest of the solar system, that plants weren't around before the sun, that humans are not the products of a special creation and are, in fact, genetically related to the other forms of life on Earth. And we know that the creation of the solar system, let alone the entire universe, took much, much longer than 6 days. These are scientific facts. These are not things that are said to insult Christians or to pull down their faith, though those facts may have that effect. They're just scientific facts, and it is not science's fault, and it is not reality's fault that it doesn't agree with a literal reading of the book of Genesis. And those are just a few facts derived from observation and experimentation that contradict a literal reading of Genesis. Gallups can call Aristotle a superstitious fool all he wants. If presented with compelling evidence that he was wrong, I'd be willing to bet Aristotle, whose epistemology valued empirical observation, would be capable of changing his mind. Can Carl Gallups say the same? The Bible doesn't only tell us about creation, just as importantly, according to Gallups, it tells us about the fall of man. Because of this, humanity is in a condition of depravity, hopeless and in need of redemption. And this, of course, is important because it's the premise of Christianity. Gallups doesn't phrase it that way, but that's the truth. That's the true truth. Quote, "The secular worldview proclaims that each of us is a moral being from within our very makeup. It declares that humanity is basically good. We commit evil deeds only because we do not have adequate education or enough money, or because someone else has harmed us or influenced us in a negative manner." Now, I know this is a pointless question because his concept of the secular worldview is so incoherent and variable, but where does he get the idea that atheists, agnostics, skeptics, etc. believe that humanity is basically good? I mean, I'm sure that there are some people who would call themselves atheists or skeptics or whatever who do believe that, but it is not a universal or a necessary part of an atheistic philosophy or an atheistic worldview. If you consider morality to be a human construct, then so are moral concepts like good and evil, which would mean that no one is born being innately good or evil. Gallups probably didn't put too much thought into that, since he only said it in order to draw another contrast between the secular worldview and his version of Christianity. Quote, "In contrast," see, I told you, "the biblical worldview declares the observed true truth. We are sinners from birth. If you have ever been around a small child, you understand this to be a fact. An infant soon learns that if it persistently cries at just the right volume, it will become the center of attention. It believes its immediate needs should be the focus of the entire universe." So there you go. Carl Gallups considers crying infants to be sinners. I'm not crazy about crying babies myself, but even I think he's a piece of shit for saying that. You're talking about a fucking baby, dude. Gallups' pessimistic attitude toward children doesn't stop when they get a little bit older. He goes on to describe how toddlers don't need to be taught to be selfish or dishonest. They were born that way. On the contrary, parents have to teach their children to be truthful and respectful of others. He says, quote, "I have yet to be acquainted with a toddler that is honest to the core, selfless and non-demanding. That tot does not exist. Why is this? Because the total condition of the human being is fallen." Yeah, that seems like a reasonable conclusion to me. Maybe that's it. Or maybe it's because human beings, be they immature children still figuring out who they are and how to behave in society, or adults who are supposed to have all that shit figured out for the most part, have multifaceted natures and personalities. Gallup says he's never met a totally honest, selfless toddler, as if that's some sort of meaningful statement. Has he ever met a totally dishonest, selfish toddler? Because I'm willing to bet he hasn't. Even the most troubled, rotten, antisocial child isn't dishonest or selfish 100% of the time. We're far too complicated creatures to be described in these simplistic, absolute terms. The fact that people are not all good from birth doesn't mean they are therefore all evil. I'm not a parent, and as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm not crazy about young children, but I have known a few in my adult life. I've known kids that seemed to be mean and angry and making trouble most of the time, and I've known kids that were full of mischief who you couldn't leave alone for a second, and I've known kids who were so sweet so giving, so concerned for other people's feelings that they made me ashamed of myself for not being a better person. I don't think it's fair to judge any of those kids or anyone else as being one particular thing from birth, especially if that thing is supposedly the result of the actions of people who never actually existed. According to the biblical worldview, salvation from sin is the most desperate need of people. Yet, those who hold the secular worldview seem to focus on saving everything but the souls of the lost. Gallups says, quote, "In secularism, a person is declared a hero if she participates in saving dolphins or trees or manatees, but is declared a villain and an outlaw if she commits her life to saving babies from bloody and violent abortions." Being opposed to abortions doesn't make you a villain. Speaking out against abortion doesn't make you an outlaw. Attempting to prevent women from exercising their legal right to have an abortion, using threats and violence against women who get or doctors who perform abortions, yeah, that will do it. Let's not get those two things confused. And what the hell does abortion have to do with the subject at hand anyway? If the greatest need of humanity is to be saved from sin, why wouldn't Gallups make his point by contrasting environmentalists with evangelists? Evangelists aren't outlaws either, but I'm sure Gallup's raging persecution complex could take care of that for him. As if saving dolphins and persecuting abortion protesters wasn't bad enough, secularism also expects us to be nice to gay people. Quote, "The secular worldview declares that homosexuality, fornication, and adultery are natural and therefore acceptable parts of the human experience. It goes as far as to declare that society's laws must protect these activities. All the while, the devastating effects of each of these perverse activities has been observed and cataloged since time immemorial. Protecting the rights of consenting adults to conduct their sex lives as they see fit." How fucking twisted can we get? The secular worldview doesn't declare anything, by the way. Gallups has contrived this particular straw man of a worldview to operate the same way as his biblical worldview does, through decrees and commands and unshakable dogmas. But most atheists, skeptics, freethinkers, whatever, don't think that way, or at least we try very hard not to think that way. We ask questions, we investigate, we look for reasons. We don't accept undemonstrated, unfalsifiable declarations as truth. Gallups may assume that we do, because that's what he does, but that's not the only way things can work. Gallups includes a lengthy quote from an interview with Dr. Christian de Duve, a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who wrote about how certain traits which were once of great use to our ancestors, like group selfishness and a tendency to worry more about the present than the future, have now become liabilities to modern humans that we have to adjust for. Dr. de Duve compared these traits to original sin, and he suggested that the writers of the Bible may have actually created the concept of original sin to explain these traits, which are actually explained by evolution. Gallup's point in presenting this interview is to say that we do have sin encoded within our nature. But the only solution, contrary to Dr. de Duve's scientific explanation, is for Jesus to heal our hearts and redeem our souls. Now, this is the depth of Gallup's bias. He not only reads, but quotes a scientist, a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, explaining that the traits attributed to original sin are actually attributable to evolution. And Gallup's response is, see, it's definitely original sin. You know, in the last episode of this series, I praised Gallups for just coming right out with it, waving his Bible around from the start, rather than dicking around with half-assed attempts at philosophy before getting to the real, hardcore Christian fundamentalism. And he's definitely sticking with that strategy in this chapter. And therein lies the greatest weakness of his argument, and the arguments of his fellow apologists. He's not showing why his worldview is the true one, and what he calls the secular worldview is false. He's merely asserting that this is the case. He's saying the secular worldview says this, but the biblical worldview says this, as though the latter is self-evidently true. He's not even attempting to do any work toward proving his case. He's assuming that none is necessary. And in this, as in so many other things, he is mistaken. Quote, although the secular worldview of Crowley, our atheist character from the first chapter, seemed to pack a devastating punch, as you will discover, his overconfidence will crumble into a heap when competently compared against true truth. Yep, it's the secular worldview that seems compelling but crumbles when compared to the truth. Gallups says this and probably doesn't get why it's funny, because something else he shares with his fellow apologists is an inability to perceive irony, and he is about to demonstrate that quite emphatically in Chapter 6, The Straw Man. This is the chapter where Gallups, who has relentlessly strawmanned arguments against his version of Christianity for the entire book to this point, shows us how atheists like Crowley, who is totally not a straw man, are the ones who are actually strawmanning Christian beliefs. When atheists, etc., liken God to the tooth fairy or a magic man in the sky, they are strawmanning Christianity, Gallups says. But first, lest his readers become confused by his technical terminology, he provides actually a very excellent, if completely oblivious, definition of the term straw man. Quote, a straw man is a fallacious argument based on a misrepresentation of the opponent's actual position. To attack a straw man is to create the illusion of having rebutted a proposition. This is done by replacing in a sneaky manner the actual position with a comparable yet non-equivalent suggestion, the straw man. Then the covert straw man is refuted rather than the actual position itself. And he spends the next several pages elaborating on this definition, which is totally unnecessary. This book itself is all the evidence I need that Carl Gallups knows exactly what a straw man is and how to construct such an argument. But here's where he attains a whole new level of oblivious. Gallups lists a series of examples of straw man tactics, all of which he himself has been guilty of in this book to this point. And here in this next quote is the last of those examples and the start of the following paragraph. And just fair warning, take measures to cushion the impact of your impending facepalm now. Are you ready? Quote, inventing a fictitious, like-minded persona, expert, or group of experts who is then appealed to in the argument. This last technique is one of the straw man arguments that Crowley used against Christopher. He describes the tactic of inventing a fictitious person to appeal to in your argument. Then he appeals to Crowley, a fictitious person he invented for the purposes of his argument, and points out that he used the same tactic. Oh, and just in case this isn't enough for you, check out the straw man tactic listed in that series of examples right before the last one. Quote, putting forth an example of a particular personality who insufficiently defends his position. That person is then presented as the ultimate defender of that position. Then that person's arguments are refuted with ease, thus giving the appearance that every advocate of the position and thus the position itself has been surmounted. Sound like anyone we know. It takes real balls, or a density comparable to that found at the center of a black hole, to perfectly describe a straw man technique on the very same page where you use that technique yourself. And in fact, just a few paragraphs before, you promise to use that same technique later in the book. Check this out. Gallups spends the rest of the chapter providing his readers with yet more well-drawn examples of straw man arguments, boldly stupidly, hoping that they won't notice that he has used the exact same sorts of arguments himself. Then he finishes up with this, quote, Crowley built several straw man scenarios against poor old Christopher. Once the straw men were constructed, he attacked those propositions as though they were the real subjects of the debate. The most devastating of his straw men he named the magic man in the sky. As this book progresses, I will dismantle this straw man piece by piece. When I do, you will see that it is nothing to fear at all. Just like the boogeyman, a child only thinks is hiding in the bedroom closet, or the scarecrow strategically placed in a cornfield. Remember the example that he cited that I quoted just before that. Putting forth an example of a particular personality who insufficiently defends his position. That person is then presented as the ultimate defender of that position. Then that person's argument are refuted with ease. He is promising to do that exact thing to Crowley, the straw man that he created. He's not only doing what he describes the straw man technique as being, but he is telling you he's going to do it. Anyway, Crowley, the straw man atheist Gallups invented, created a straw man of his own, the magic man in the sky. To paraphrase William James, it looks like it's straw men all the way down. Gallups is right, though. Straw men are nothing to fear. They're harmless, and that's why I don't sweat Crowley or Christopher or the clueless hypocrite who invented them. That's it for this chapter. That's it for this video. I'll be back in the next video in this series to cover the next 3 chapters of this book. They would be Chapter 7, Dismantling the Straw Man, as promised. Chapter 8, Looking Down from on High. And Chapter 9, The Seen and the Unseen. Those are the chapters I'll be covering in the next video. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so very much for watching. I appreciate your attention and your interest, and that this has been of some use to you. Please leave a comment on this video. Challenge me, agree with me, tell me I got something right, tell me I got something wrong, I could have done something better. Whatever you have to say, whatever your responses are to this video, I am very interested to read them. I hope that I hear from some of you, and I will see you guys in the next video.